In today's episode, we'll wrap up our journey through the life and times of Erwin Rommel by tackling the most controversial aspects: his politics, his connection to atrocities, and his role in the Hitler assassination attempt of July 1944.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again, another week, another podcast, continuing the Rommel story. I think when we started to talk about doing an episode on Rommel, we said, we're probably going to have one. And I don't know, we've got this is the third one. Exactly, fools. This is not how we work. I think every listener and viewer has figured this out by now. I think the last one, we didn't even have that many tangents, so we have to squeeze in a few this time, I think. But yes, episode 3 on Rommel. I think we need 3 to do this person justice, because he's not just any general. He's probably, arguably, the most famous German general of World War II, particularly in the English-speaking world. And again, maybe a topic we'll return to later when we talk about his legacy. So, my usual question: where do we start from? What do we need to do in order to get everyone back up to speed to talk about Rommel?
Right, no shortage of things to talk about with Rommel, of course, not only because of what he does during the war, but as you said, because of his historical reputation after the war, which, let's say, is convenient as well for the Allied side, for him to have taken on the legendary mythological stature that he has. Look, over the course of the last 2 episodes, we essentially talked through his military career with a fair number of assessments. What was he good at? What was he criticized for? What did his contemporaries think about him? How did his ideas about how to fight change over time? How did his personality play into that? So all that stuff we've talked about in the previous 2 episodes. We saved the historical debates about everything aside from his performance as a military commander for this episode. And I think it might make sense for us to start with, let's start with the political side of it. There's often a discussion about many German commanders. To what extent were they convinced Nazis? To what extent did they just sort of tolerate it? A couple of them actually resisted and went against it at different times. Where does Rommel fall on this spectrum? And what's the sort of evidence? What kind of arguments have been made about that? So we can start there, and then we can go to the July 20th plot, and then to the atrocities, or wherever destiny takes us, I guess. But I would probably start with the political side, Matthias, if you wish.
I think that's a very good idea. Yes. Shall I begin?
Sure. Why not? Get the ball rolling.
Yeah. So I think one of the important things is, generally speaking, when we talk about political views and relationship to Nazis and Nazism and all this, you need to look at the formative years of individuals. How and where do they get their political ideas from, whether it's Nazism or whatever it is? And I think when you look at Rommel, just like with so many other people in Germany, the formative years are the years right after the First World War. So we talked about this in the previous episode, the impact that had on Rommel, just like anybody else in Germany. And of course, he's an army officer, so of course he's got some certain views, even though he comes from a liberal background. We talked about his home and his family a little bit, and I think in the first episode. But I also think that these years are very, very important, because you come back from the front, you've lost the war, and suddenly there's sheer chaos in Germany, and everything's falling apart. No one knows at that time where this will go and what it will lead to. Are you going to have a completely communist Germany? Are you going to have another revolution? Are you going to have a proper civil war? I mean, there are uprisings, of course, in Germany. There is fighting in Germany between 1918 and, roughly speaking, 1920. In the Ruhr era, for example, there's some really nasty fighting that goes on there between the army and the communist socialist uprisers. Hundreds of people are killed. So there is that. So this period. And when you look at some of the statements that Rommel made and some of these things that other historians have also mentioned, they always say that this is really an important period for him. And he writes back to his wife and says, well, it looks as if everyone's trying to kill one another. There's complete mayhem here. Everything is falling apart. And this is not how it's supposed to be. And because he comes back with his unit from the front line and back to the home garrison, he, of course, is then brought out by the authorities to restore order in some areas. And he does that, so the accounts tell us, reasonably well without using force. So it's just his sheer personality. He appears somewhere. Some people said he's got a bit of an aura. I think in one of the previous episodes, I said it's also just the simple fact that they've got a decorated war hero here. That probably helps as well in that respect. And he's able to bring back order in the small area that is responsible for without using a lot of force. But I think that this left a lasting impression on him, just like everybody else. And this is probably the formative period and the formative time. Most people then say, people who've worked on Rommel and have written about Rommel, that he then is quite apolitical to begin with. So with that, again, you might say he fits the typical bill of a German army officer of that particular period. These guys, in theory, of course not all of them were, but in theory are supposed to be apolitical. The idea behind that being the army is the instrument of the state, and so everybody in uniform serves the state, not a particular government or particular party, which is also the reason why all the way up to the end of World War II, German officers or German soldiers, not only officers, for example, were not allowed to vote. Because they say the moment you give them the vote, you will bring political unrest into the armed forces, and we don't want that. And some people have argued that he is apolitical. Other people have said, well, he's probably just very naive when it comes to political matters. Because even if you are apolitical, of course you have a political view or view on politics and what goes on in your country. I think it's probably in these years and also the early years when he gets to get close to the regime, in particular to Hitler himself, as we explored in another episode, that this naivety and perhaps slight apolitical stance then, to begin with, perhaps also leads him in some sort of interesting areas where he's leading a bit more towards the Nazi party. Of course, he doesn't become a member because he's not allowed to, but just the closeness to Hitler is when there are a number of statements from him while he's, for example, in the Führerbegleit-Kommando, while he then goes into Poland, where he talks about this. And you can see there is a little bit of a link towards the Nazi regime and talking about the Jews once or twice, talking about Hitler, how he restored order, all these things. So which you might say links back to the 1918 one. So that's just my very general analysis of that. I'm not quite sure what your views are on that, because I know it's a very hot potato, isn't it? The moment you start talking politics and Nazis and German officers, it's always a hot potato. And of course, we can drill in and go into the detail.
I mean, I think one of the big challenges about this type of question, and it's the case not only for Rommel, but there's been his interest in trying to figure out the politics or assess the politics of many different German high-ranking generals. And the answers fall in all sorts of different places, not only for different generals, but also there are different arguments, that will say, well, one historian might see a particular general being more Nazi-friendly than another would. For some, it's more clear, and there's less debate. For Rommel, I think it's a combination of things. Yes, my impression is, from what I've read, that he doesn't come into the 1920s thinking, yeah, I like this obscure, semi-obscure Hitler guy, and I see everything his way. But, even though there's this ideal of an apolitical army, as you correctly point out, it doesn't mean that people in the army don't have political opinions. And even, I would say, in that very unstable period, just after 1918, the army also makes some political decisions. I mean, they are clear that we want to cooperate with the Social Democratic government to crush the farther left uprisings, one of which you mentioned in the Ruhr, but there are others, the Spartakists in Berlin in 1919. There's also then the whole situation of the Kapp Putsch, where the army is also, some people in the army are partially involved, others not. So no matter what the army wants, the army is connected to politics. So it's a super murky area, and Rommel is a part of that. Now, As an individual, like many, if not most other officers, he's anti-communist, he's patriotic / nationalistic, if you will. He's very embittered at the way the war turns out and at the Versailles Treaty. And like many other people when you're making a political decision, if these big motivations are, bitterness and fear of disorder, you're willing to make common cause or accept a lot from a political party, especially if your career benefits a lot from that political party, which Rommel's does in the 1930s when, as you say, he becomes the commander of Hitler's bodyguard unit. And even before then, when Hitler's already sort of positively disposed towards him. So these are the kinds of different motivations that I think make sense before we jump into he either was or was absolutely not a Nazi. He's somewhere in between, I think, like many others were. If Hitler's standing up there saying, I hate the Treaty of Versailles and we should revise it and we should have an army again, and also I'm okay with making war and I want to persecute the Jews, no matter what your opinion, even if you're have sort of, let's say, typical anti-Semitic views, which many people had at the time, where you don't really like the Jews very much, but you're not envisioning gas chambers or anything like that, you might find that an appealing political message because you're focused on another aspect. You don't mind, maybe, that the political party is negatively disposed towards the Jews, but you really like that they're negatively disposed towards the Versailles Treaty. So this ends up, and over time, you can become closer to them, as you mentioned. So Rommel is sort of on record being sympathetic to the idea of the Führer cult, basically, like the cult of personality, or this kind of Nazi idea of like this Volksgemeinschaft, this mystical kind of organic unity of the nation. So he found something in those ideas of the Nazis. He also did have something to say, and this is a little bit later. So there's in the 30s, there's a politicization a bit more of the army because the Nazis don't think the army should be apolitical that much, right? They have a more all-encompassing view. So, Rommel's a part of that. He writes at some point, and I'm translating on the fly here from the German, today the soldier must be political. The Wehrmacht is the sword of the new German worldview. Weltanschauung is worldview, right? So you can see that he's kind of moving in the general direction without necessarily thumping on the table at every Nazi party meeting or what have you. So that's the way I try to start negotiating this topic. I don't know how you feel about all of that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think you mentioned a number of key aspects. And this is getting a bit wider than just Rommel, isn't it? Because it's a very broad, it's a very difficult subject, of course. I think we probably at some stage have to do probably a 20-part series on the Holocaust and all these things. So we can only scratch the surface here. But I think one of the most important things you said is this. You have, of course, generally speaking, it's not related to Rommel now, but anti-Semitism in Germany, like you have in most other European countries at the time. But even when they start introducing all these Nuremberg laws and all these things, no one at that stage is kind of picturing gas chambers or what have you. And I mean, even when you look at the Nazi elite, what they were thinking, that was, of course, first of all, force them to emigrate and all these things. So there's a process there that you find. And I think that is reflected in Rommel. Of course, it's a bit difficult because in those days, I think the whole Rommel cult, historiography, what have you, also in the early years after the Second World War, was not really about questions with the Jews. There were other things that were more important, like the military ones. So we need to look very closely at the sources and what we can find. But again, you've got some of these contradictions. So you just gave that one quote about the Weltanschauung. I mean, I think that's an important one. And the question, of course, there is also, when does he say this? Because you can also find in personal reports, annual reports, when you go through them, through the Nazi, but you can see how the wording changes. And by 1943, 1944, it was more or less mandatory to put in, well, he's a convinced National Socialist, because you knew exactly if you don't put that line in, you're not going to get promoted. Whether you were or were not didn't really make any difference at all. It's a bit like putting today in an annual report, he's a team player. So people didn't really think about it, but knew if you don't put that in, you're not going to get promoted. So it's basically sometimes these phrases can also be a bit meaningless. That's why you need to really look at the context when it was said, and that makes it really, really difficult. And we can probably do an entire episode just on that one statement that you just made. There are accounts from him where he talks about Hitler. He writes a letter to his wife and says, well, he's such a charismatic person. He's got an aura. He's just impressive. You then have account interviews also with his son called Manfred. Rommel's, I think, elder brother was called Manfred. He died in his infancy, so that's probably why his son was called Manfred. He gives an interview. Of course, the question is always how reliable are family members as sources, but he said, well, there are all sorts of incidents where he protected Jews, where he tried to help Jews. There is an account when he was commanding officer in Goslar, where he clashed with the SA who were going around beating up Jews. He said that's not how it's done. You might now argue again, it's a broader picture, not related to Rommel. Is this because he didn't like Jews, or is it because he didn't like the way it was done? That's the next question that follows out of this, because it's not done in an orderly fashion. And let's face it, that goes against the German soul. You need to do things in order. So there are all sorts of really different aspects. In 1938, he travels to Switzerland, and he writes back and he says that talk to Swiss soldiers, and the quote is, they showed remarkable understanding of our Jewish problem. So again, what does that mean? So is he just playing the party line here? It always depends who's reporting to. So it's a bit, I would say, it's a difficult subject and a bit of an enigma, because there is not that one statement where it says, I hate the Jews, or I think it's stupid what goes on with the Jews. There are other people, Eric Searle, for example, a historian, has written about this. And he says, well, it's very difficult to find evidence that shows that he was really very, very anti-Semitic or something like this. Some people have called, some historians have called this rubbish, this idea. Are we trying to read too much into it? Is this what's the right word? Is that the aura? Is that the culture that you have at that particular time, and he just fits in? There are all sorts of different points, different arguments, different leads. Some people saying he was protecting Jewish people who were living in this area when he was a commanding officer. We had this quote about the Jews to the Swiss people. So you can see all sorts of different messages being sent. And this is why I always think when you look at this, you have to be really careful that you see what is being said and who's it being said to. I think that's absolutely crucial. He also has got some sort of really weird ideas. Again, sometimes maybe he's a bit coming back to this naivety, because he at one stage, he has a meeting with Hitler later in the war, and he says, well, wouldn't it be a great idea if we have a Gauleiter, so one of the political leaders in Germany, so some of the leaders of the party, if we had a Jew as a Gauleiter, because that would make all that propaganda from the Western Allies go away. And Hitler just looks at him and says, well, my dear Rommel, you've got absolutely no understanding of what my thinking is. I would say, you might say, is that the naive bit or not? It's very difficult to really put your finger onto it. But he's far less, at least we could see, far less National Socialist than a lot of other people. When you look at, I mentioned Strohn in a different episode, who is very, very much a Nazi general. When you look at some of the orders he puts out, it's all about Nazism, it's about race, it's about this, it's about that. You don't find that from Rommel. And sometimes the wording, as I said, and sometimes wording that is being used is kind of the official wording you have to use if you want to sign orders or whatever you say. It's a sometimes it's a very difficult subject. So you have to be really, really precise and really, really drill in. And I'm not quite sure if all historians are always doing this justice, because I think one way or another, whether using Rommel's example, yes, he's absolute Nazi, or no, he's no Nazi at all. It's very easy to cherry pick, isn't it? But that's not how it should be done. And it's a very, very, very difficult subject.
And sometimes it depends how you look at the question, right? And again, all this is, we're trying to, just listeners and viewers out there, because this is a sensitive topic, I'm not trying to sit here and defend everything Rommel did and was, and I don't have, this idea that, oh my God, he was not a Nazi at all, and that's what I want to get across on the podcast. It's not that at all. It's almost like, how do you frame the focus that you want? Because if we say I, as a historically interested observer, my threshold for a judgment on this question is, did he actively resist or not? And we'll also get to that as well. Or did he contribute to the regime and what it was doing by his, leadership position, by his closeness to Hitler and all that? Well, then obviously that pushes your assessment of him farther to the Nazi side, even though there are other pieces of evidence that don't fit with that. You can say, well, look, in the end, he was a leader for the military that was carrying out the Nazis' political goals. So that is my decisive kind of, that's where that weighs in the scale more than a more detailed consideration of individual statements or impressions from others and that sort of thing. It's two different ways of weighing the problem, I guess I could say. And, an example of one of these individual pieces of evidence that one can weigh in different ways, I think, is a statement from Goebbels about Rommel. Goebbels is famous for having kept these diaries. And he writes of Rommel in 1942, October 1942. So I guess just before Second Alamein goes wrong. He says, and again, we have this word Weltanschauung, so this Nazi-ish word for worldview. He says, his worldview is firm. It's like it's set. He does not only, I'm translating it on the fly here from the German, he's not only close to us National Socialists, rather, he is a National Socialist. That's quite a dramatic statement from Goebbels. You might say Goebbels wants that to be true, and he's not in Rommel's head. But then the next statement from Goebbels is interesting and muddies things as well a little bit. He says, if the Führer had not sort of gone to bat for Rommel so much, he would probably still be somewhere in Germany or in a backwater part of the front as a colonel, or maybe as a lower ranking general, Generalmajor, in some sort of unimportant formation. This is what Goebbels writes. So on the one hand, he says, yes, philosophically, he's with us and he's convinced. On the other hand, he says, and part of that is because we're in power and made his career, which is almost a bit of a contradiction. Again, it depends how you decide to slice it. If you judge Rommel as much for running with the Nazis because of his career aspirations versus his deep philosophical convictions, those probably overlap somewhat, but not entirely. I think that's probably fair to say. It depends which one of those, how you weigh those things. I admit I tend to probably come down a little more on if you run with them and take a big important leadership position and enable their Holocaust to happen indirectly, then I probably come down critically on that, I would say. But it's a part of this, how do we think about these, right? What factors are we weighing?
And that's interesting, isn't it? And your last sentence there, of course, that takes us right to the heart of this whole debate about not only atrocities, but how do you remember the war, commemorate the war, the legacy of the war. I mean, that is really, really important. And this is the debate that's been ongoing ever since. Are you the defender of your fatherland, or are you, by doing that, making all these things possible? That's a debate that was had in those days, and that runs through all the way to today. It's even a big debate that you still have for example, in the German armed forces today. So there is, it's called the Traditionserlass, so it's the order on tradition, and that's the official statement on what is a tradition in the German armed forces, what you can remember, what you can't remember. And it states very, very clearly that the Wehrmacht as an institution is not the foundation for any sort of tradition because it served an evil regime. So there is absolutely no links to World War II in the tradition of the German Bundeswehr today. It then states that, however, you can have individuals, but that's also interesting because as part of the tradition and to commemorate their behavior and whatever, But this is not restricted, well, it's not limited to military actions. But if you want to choose somebody, make them a founder of tradition or figurehead of tradition, it needs to be normally military sound, but also needs to have done something in order to fight against or whatever the Nazi regime when you restrict it to World War II now. And that's a huge debate. And this is, we can return to this perhaps in a minute, this is where Rommel is absolutely in the center, because that's linked to his role on the 20th of July. And that is, it's an ongoing debate, even in the German military. I don't know the exact date, I would have to look it up, about a year ago or so. They tried to change this a little bit. And they said, because now we're looking at a big continental war, potentially against Russia or somewhere else on the eastern flank. Wouldn't it be a great idea if we concentrate a bit more on the military values in our tradition? And a good friend of mine wrote this. He worked at the Ministry of Defense at the time. He wrote this, had it all signed off. It was published. And I don't know the exact time frame, about, I think, a week or 2 weeks later, that was pinned by the Ministry of Defense again. We said that's pushing us into a very, very, very wrong direction. And it's interesting because, well, I mean, you said that you come down, if you're serving this regime, even if you're apolitical, but you're serving the regime, you come down that side, you're supporting the wrong regime. My view is very different. I would say, as long as you're completely apolitical, you're trying to serve your country, protect your country, and fight a clean war, then it's very different. And this is, of course, exactly the dilemma that lots of people had in those days as well. Again, 20th of July debate is one of these. So some people saying, well, we know we've got an evil regime. On the other hand, we're fighting a war for national survival. Of course, now you can say, okay, it was started by the Germans, an invasion of Poland. That's, of course, not how they would have seen it. It was a very different framework. Where do you come down on that? That makes it really difficult. And it's also very clear to see, and again, we can link that to Rommel in a minute, that the views here have really, really changed, also in Germany, up to, I would say, probably the early to mid-60s. People like the 20th of July, people were mainly seen as traitors because they were stabbing the army and the people in the back. And that's now completely changed. But in the 50s and 60s, that was something you didn't talk about. If you bring it back to Rommel, the Rommel family did not stress, and we'll talk about in a minute, his perceived, alleged, or real role in the 20th of July plot, because they knew that that was tarnish his reputation and the image as a great military leader in the 50s and early 60s. So, as we all know, history is not something that happens. It's always the interpretation through our current lenses, isn't it? And that makes it difficult, but also very interesting. So it's a fascinating and very difficult topic. And a very German topic as well.
I think that if one does not find history difficult to grapple with, you're just not actually getting to grips with it.
That is true. That is very true.
You're not going about it, the historical and the historian's way. I mean, there are shades of difference, obviously, in how we approach, you and I, this particular question, but that doesn't mean either of us sees it as all black and all white and everything in this bin and everything in that bin. And that, I hope anyway, maybe now I'm getting a bit too cocky, but I think that's what makes a responsible approach to history, right? Is trying to find a place on that spectrum that's not all the way at one end or all the way at the other. One of the other, hopefully in a related vein, some of the other topics about Rommel that have to do with his connection to Nazi atrocities or Nazi ideology, they have to do with, did he carry out orders for executions of like Free French troops or British long-range desert group or Free French African troops? And there is very little evidence that he followed up on what he was ordered to do from above to execute people. So that speaks to a military ethic that he was able to probably mostly maintain. On the other hand, there's the question of the Jewish population in North Africa, right? One can say, okay, there's a greater distance between him and the Holocaust that's happening in Central and Eastern Europe because he didn't hold a big field command on the Eastern Front. He didn't have Einsatzgruppen to cooperate with in his rear or what have you. But in North Africa, there was a historic Jewish population, and there was a plan eventually to eliminate them through Einsatzkommandos, so the similar type of setup on the Eastern Front. And there is some discussion there. What was his knowledge of that? What was his involvement in that? Did he meet with the person who was going to become the commander or the overseer of these groups, a man by the name of Walter Rauff? Some historians argue, yes, he definitely met and knew about the plan, and that's, a black mark on him, even though the plan was never fully carried out. Or no, it's circumstantial. He might not have had that many meetings. Then others will say, look, he probably had a general idea of what was happening in terms of atrocities because he's so high up, he's connected to other people and other parts of the Nazi regime. He couldn't have not had a clearish picture of what was happening because of how high up he was. The problem with arguments in either direction is that there's no overwhelming amount of evidence far in one direction or far in the other. So we're working with a lot of gaps.
Now, that's very true. And in the Einsatzkommando, Egypt, as it was called, is a very good example of this. You mentioned the Rauf chap, so he was supposed to be in charge of that. And again, there are arguments, and there's, if you want to call it evidence, pointing in all sorts of different directions. So there's a post-war CIA report, for example, which states that Rommel and Rauf had a meeting, and in which Rommel has a complete go at him and says, "We're not doing this. You're not killing any of Jews in my area of responsibility." But then other people have argued, well, that's great, but it's a post-war CIA report. And actually, when you look at where these guys were, they weren't even the same area that day when it's supposed to have happened. So again, it depends on how you interpret these things. It could be because post-war CIA reports, this is now the Cold War's beginning to form. So you want to get the veterans, the West German establishment in on your side and say, well, this is what it says here. So Rommel never did anything bad. So he's great. So you can have Rommel. I mean, that would sit in line quite nicely with the whole thing about war criminals who get released early in the 1950s from the prisons because everyone thinks, well, particularly the Americans think, we can use them for our open war or not open war against the Soviet Union. So
Cold War, yeah.
Cold War, yeah. So there's all sorts of really interesting aspects and facets that play into this one here. And of course, other arguments, other people have said, yes, no, they had meetings, Rommel knew about this, but then, of course, because by the time the unit was supposed to be activated, it was over anyway. And of course, they don't get even to Egypt. So yes, you have, of course, Jewish population somewhere else, but then these people say, well, the unit didn't even arrive there to carry out their atrocious acts because by that stage it was over. I mean, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in the US, they have said that Rommel's relationship to this Einsatzkommando Egypt was problematic. That's the word that they use. Other people say, well, no, it wasn't. And whatever he did, that was very, very clear. I mean, in some ways, you might say the whole North Africa campaign because is what's the right word? Blessed is perhaps too strong a word, but it's because you don't have these huge and large Jewish communities. Yes, you do have some, but also the fighting is very different. So in many ways, you don't even give people who want to execute and exterminate the Jews the opportunity to do it at the same scale. So it might have been completely different if Rommel had been sent to the Eastern Front. Who knows? And then you get an Einsatzgruppe under your command. And again, there are lots of generals there where you've got the Einsatzgruppe operating in your back. How do you deal with them? So that in some ways for him, of course, is a blessing. So he didn't even get pushed into this very, very nasty area to the same degree that other people did.
I mean, for the record, I would say, and this is spontaneous, so I have not read up on it, but if I remember right, I do think there was some victims, some killed in the small North African Jewish communities, but I don't know under what exact circumstances, so I don't want to go too far with that.
I think a number were killed, but as far as I know, again, I would have to do a bit more research. And I don't think it's this Einsatzkommando because they came there.
No, it isn't. No, it was under other circumstances.
Exactly.
But I'm not 100% sure.
No.
So I can't. I want to acknowledge that.
Yes,
but I can't tie it to Rommel because I haven't read enough on that particular topic. In any case, I'm glad you brought up the theme of after the war because this, I think, plays a big role in how we think about Rommel and some arguments about him or not. I mean, the British also want to have an interest in building up Rommel's stature. so that it looks extra good, of course, that they were able to defeat him. So if you build up your defeated enemy as having been a sort of a genius, a Superman in a way, then it's to your credit that you were able to defeat him. And if you want to rehabilitate some elements of the Wehrmacht in order to help with your new alliance with West Germany and building up a West German military then in the 1950s, it makes sense to have some figures like Rommel or Adolf Galland, who's also a bit of a controversial guy. It was to his reputation, who are supposed to be clean German war heroes, if you will. The reality is obviously a lot more complex than that. And I will also say, for the record, the Soviets did also use former German intelligence officers, Sicherheitsdienst people in the East German regime. It's just that gets less publicity. The Soviets also reused Nazis for their purposes. It's just usually because Soviet propaganda, I think, for decades emphasized that the Western countries did this, that it's sort of a bit hushed up that they did it as well, frankly, in many cases. Slight tangent there of critique against the Soviet Union. Do we want to go to July 20th now? That's the other big topic with Rommel. Do you want to get us started on it?
I don't think we need to talk too much about what actually happens, because we had an entire episode on that. But so this is it's an interesting topic. So Rommel's involvement in this whole plot, and this again is something that's really gained traction. Well, I think probably for the last 20 years. Before that, no one really cared too much. Rommel was seen as the great military leader, and that was enough. As you've already said, interesting enough, it started in the English-speaking world. I think the first 5 biographies of Rommel are all in the English language, or were in the English language, for the reasons that you already mentioned. And so he's just this military hero, and he remains as such. And then, because of the changes that we mentioned earlier, even within the armed forces, are suddenly beginning to look more closely at what did people actually do in the war. Being just a military leader is not good enough. You need to do a bit more. You need to work against the regime if you want to stay within the tradition of the German armed forces. And that includes simple things like having barracks named after you. There was a big controversy not all that long ago where there was an Eduard Dietl barracks for the mountain troops. And Dietl, the hero of Narvik, as he was called, well, he was a Nazi through and through. So it still astonishes me that they managed to give this name, his name to the barracks.
Dietl is
quite
choice.
something. So he's gone, and lots of other people are gone now. They're changing and renaming and doing all sorts of things. And one of the big debates is about the Generalfeldmarschall Rommel Kaserne, because that is the German army's largest barracks still today. In Augustdorf, it's North Rhine-Westphalia, the northeastern corner, and that is the largest barracks. And there were lots of people who said, no, we need to change this. We can't have a barrack named after him. Other examples, Mölders, the fighter pilot, he had a fighter wing named after him. That's gone. So you can see it's a theme that's developing. And Rommel really is the one, because everyone says, well, he's the desert fox, so we can't do that because of his military achievement. The political context says that's not enough. And now, as a consequence of that, I would argue, we've now started to look much more at his political involvement. And again, I know a number of people, a very good friend of mine, I would say, is an absolute expert on Rommel. He's done a lot of work also for the army and for the military establishment. He was, okay, what did he actually do? And so that's still a bit contested today, but I think we're beginning to get a bit of a view and a bit of an understanding of what he actually did. And the underlying problem, of course, here is also that, while he has got this accident, well, not accident, but his car is strafed, as we explained, and he fractures his skull, I think, 3 times, on the 17th of July, so 3 days before the coup is actually carried out. So if he'd still been there, I mean, look at some of the analysis and some of what people have written. Everyone was hoping that he, together with another chap called Stülpnagel, who's in France, the military commander in France, that they would have taken over all of France. And just because of Rommel and his sheer personality and charisma, would have been able to swing the pendulum towards the, let's call them the uprisers or whatever you want to call them. And that would have changed things. But the problem is, of course, he couldn't really talk about this, and he wasn't involved in it. It would have been very different if he'd been on the 20th of July and sent out a telegram saying, well, hurrah, Hitler's dead, we're now taking over. That doesn't happen. And that's one of the big problems. So we need to go to secondary sources, and we need to go to other accounts and interrogation reports that we have because the SD afterwards carried out all these tortures and tried to get information. That's how we need to put this picture together.
And some of those sources that were created at the time were then lost in the next 10 months of war and bombing and all the rest of it. So there are quite a lot of gaps, which fuels the debate because there's more room for speculation or reasoned argument in one direction or the other. As one thing that is clear, I think anyway, from what I've read, is that Rommel realized, as did many others, he wasn't unique in this, that the war was going to be lost. By mid 1944, he realized that the war was going to be lost. And to his credit, he tells Hitler this, because you have quite a few generals who realize the war is going to be lost, but they never said that to anybody above them in the chain of command or on the political side. Now, maybe Rommel felt he could do that because of his long-standing relationship with Hitler, which could be used against him in this historical debate. But so these kind of pluses and minuses, if you reduce it to that, which I don't like doing, but sometimes they actually play off of each other, which makes the historical conclusion even trickier. So he writes this to Hitler on the 15th of July, 1944. So 2 days before he gets so badly wounded that he's just out of the fight. And again, I'm translating on the fly from the German here. The soldiers are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is coming to an end. In my opinion, it's necessary to draw the conclusions from this situation. I feel duty-bound as Supreme Commander of my army group to clearly state this. So he says this directly to Hitler. And interestingly enough, I read an account where initially he had not just written the consequences, but political consequences. And then he was convinced by a fellow officer that might anger Hitler, so just remove that political word to soften it a little bit. So there you can see him, at the very least in this occasion, taking a sort of ethical stand, saying, we can't win this war. Essentially, we need to find a way to end it. You can say he does that for nationalistic reasons, to preserve as much of Germany as possible. He doesn't tell Hitler, you should resign or anything like that. On the other hand, he's doing and saying something publicly to the dictator of the country that goes against the grain. And that cannot be ignored either, I don't think.
No, you're absolutely right. And as you say, it's an analysis of the military situation, which then leads him to the next step, which is an interesting development in itself, because, and I think we've said this a number of times now over the last few episodes, that he's quite often seen as the apolitical soldier, is only interested in military things. Well, obviously, he's beginning to think outside of that pure military box. And so apparently the person said, well, you might want to take political out because that will just flare up Hitler. So that apparently it was Speidel, so his chief of staff. He was relatively involved in the 20th of July plot, who's then also afterwards interrogated and tortured, and he then becomes a very, very senior NATO general after the war. But that's a really interesting one. He's not the only one to do that. So there are other people as well. Rundstedt, for example, he's allegedly, he rang the OKW and reported the situation, and then they say, well, everything's falling apart here in the West, and they say, well, what are we supposed to do? And apparently just said, well, make peace, you idiots. That's not recorded, but he was sacked shortly afterwards, so it might well be true. So you can see there is this, that he's beginning to think this. There are other snippets of information. Some people have argued the first time this relationship between Hitler and Rommel really cracks is in the summer of 1943, where there's another meeting, and apparently Hitler says to Rommel, well, if the German army loses, or the German military and Germany lose the war, the German people can just rot, I don't care. Which links with the Nero order from 1945 and all these things. The German people are the weaker one. The Asiatic hordes have won, and they will now rule the world. So there's no need for the German people to survive. So you can see there's a continuity in Hitler's thinking there. And apparently this was the first time that something cracked in Rommel, because he said apparently afterwards But I'm quite glad that all my guys from Africa are now in captivity and don't have to fight for this regime anymore. So as everything, it's probably a development. You don't wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm going to kill Hitler now. These things are always journeys. And of course, then the next thing around us is, what's the context like? Who's informing and who's influencing him? Where does he get the information from? So, for example, he also talked about and complained about the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. He did that and sent a report back up the chain of command, said this is not how German soldiers behave and so on and so forth. We need to put these people on trial and probably execute them. So you can see there is a sense of some sort of sense of justice. We talked about where he sits with all of this, but there is within that military realm, you might say, there seems to be a sense of justice here. And the two people that he constantly deals with when it comes to this are, of course, Speidel, that's his chief of staff, who is very much involved in the 20th of July plot. You then have a chap called Hofacker, Cäsar von Hofacker, and of course you've got Stülpnagel, who's the commander of the German forces in France, and he is also one of the leaders. And they would have constant professional interaction. Of course, while he's the chief of staff, you see him every day, and he can just kind of drip feed you information and things. Again, we're never quite sure this is how it really happened because they didn't really talk about this. But in this Rommel film, I mentioned the Rommel film a number of times, the German Rommel film from a few years ago, this is brought out quite nicely. So how do you shape and influence the thinking? And then when the 20th of July happened, so he, of course, is out. But, of course, this is where the next step happens because his name gets mentioned a number of times by the conspirators. And that then puts him into very, very, very deep trouble.
Yeah, as far as I know, he was very likely aware of the plot, but not directly involved in planning it. I think that's probably a fair assessment that even with the spotty records that we have, I think that's more or less, from what I can gather, the consensus, which means he was aware of it and didn't go and report it, right? So I've also read some arguments that, after the war, there were also some people who, now maybe not in the 50s and 60s, but then after that, had an interest in making it seem like he was more involved because then politically in Germany, it was more positively seen to have been involved. It's murky, or that he didn't want Hitler to be killed, but he also didn't want Hitler to continue ruling the country and sending it towards destruction. But you can't nail that down 100%. There's no smoking gun document that proves this one way or the other. Goebbels again wrote about Rommel after all of this happened in November 1944. And he says Stülpnagel provided proof that Field Marshals Kluge and Rommel were involved in the putsch, in the coup planning, even though they weren't involved in the actual assassination attempt. And then he says, I think we can thank destiny that both are now dead. Now, how reliable is this from Goebbels? That is also tough to say. Goebbels is not always a clear-eyed source when it comes to his political assessments or maybe his opinions about threats to his regime that he was so dedicated to. But his admiration of Rommel as a fellow Nazi that I quoted from before is now gone, and he's perfectly willing to believe that Rommel's involved somehow in this conspiracy against Hitler. For what that is worth, it's a source that is not the most reliable, one must say.
Well, that is very true. But again, of course, they're also putting, A and B and T and 3 together and connecting all the dots and crossing and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the information that they had, the first time that the name Rommel comes up actually is when the commander of the German troops in France, a chap called Karl-Heinrich Stülpnagel, he's actually the one who's successful. So he takes over Paris and most of France during the plot. So everyone knows he's involved. He is then summoned to come back to Berlin. So he jumps in the car. And that's also interesting. Tells you a lot about their worldview and their frame of reference. So he then drives to Verdun, so the famous battlefield of the First World War. and tries to shoot himself on the battlefield of Verdun. I mean, that's an interesting, nothing to do with Hitler and the plot, but just this link between First and Second World Wars. He doesn't succeed. He only blinds himself. He is then taken to car, taken to hospital, and they get him back together again, and then he's interrogated. Later on, he's put in front of the People's Court, and then he's executed at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. And while he's being transported from the battlefield to wherever they take him, hospital or whatever, apparently he mutters constantly the word Rommel, 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 Rommel. And some people say, Rommel, why didn't you help us? Or why have you left us? Something like this. So it's the first time the name Rommel comes up. And then they know that Speidel, so Rommel's chief of staff, well, he's got something to do with that as well. They assume, they're not entirely sure, of course. So they arrest him. They interrogate him, which of course means they torture him. And this is a very, very kind of grey area. No one really knows what happened there. I'm not the expert on this. Just having talked to this very good friend of mine who is an expert on Rommel, he said that during these interrogations, and we don't have the accounts, we don't have the records, that's the problem, he said that Speidel probably gave Rommel away. I don't know if this is true, but that's what this guy who's done a lot of research on Rommel said. Well, he talked and gave Rommel up. And based on these two things, Rommel was then, of course, suddenly in the spotlight. And yes, and then, of course, the final episode of Rommel's life happens, which is just absolutely bizarre, if you ask me.
Another piece of evidence that I thought was interesting, and I haven't read the book cover to cover, but German military historian, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, Sönke Neitzel, he wrote a few books based on audio recordings that were taken of German prisoners by the British. And the British had some higher-ranking German prisoners as well, and they recorded them. And apparently, at some point, there was also a mention of Rommel with this resistance, I guess you could say, against Hitler. So there is a fair bit of circumstantial evidence putting Rommel closer than not, I think, to the plot, even though he's not, a real operational part of it, that he's somehow definitely sympathetic to it and okay that it's happening at the very least, I think is probably fair to say. Of course, it doesn't pan out. And then, as you referred to, everything comes to an end. Basically, the interrogators show up and say, Burgdorf is one of them. I think Meisel is the other one who show up at Rommel's place. He's still recovering from his injuries or whatever. And they say, look, you're going to come with us to the forest, and here's a capsule of cyanide or whatever it is. Apparently, they offer a trial, but I'm not sure that the Nazi government would have really been seriously wanted to put him on trial. This is much more convenient. So anyway, he, quote unquote, commits suicide, I guess, under extreme duress, and that's the end of Rommel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole thing is just it's really bizarre. And when you look at what happens, well, one step before that, it's not a moment of glory for the senior German military officer cohort, because they interrogate Speidel, and apparently he says, well, Rommel was involved, and so the argument goes, he shifts the blame onto Rommel away from him, trying to save his own neck. So again, there's debate about this and all this, but this is one of the arguments. Plus the other things, the other piece of information that they're beginning to put together now that the name Rommel pops up every now and then. So that something is happening with Rommel. As we said, how far I was involved, yes or no, at that stage, for that regime, it didn't make a huge difference. So what to do now? So you have to put him on trial. The way it works in those days is that, of course, you can't just put an officer on trial because he's protected by military laws. So you need to have basically a board, a court of military honor, which decides what's happening with that person. These are military people. And the board that's now convinced, basically it's a drumhead court martial, you might say. That's all it is. So the people you've got there for this particular incident is, for example, Wilhelm Keitel, so head of the OKW, Gerd von Rundstedt, commander in the West, Heinz Guderian, famous tank commander, Walter Schroth, Specht, lots of more and other generals involved there. And they look at this and look at the information from Speidel. Hofacker is also interrogated. And then they say, okay, we can see here that something's happening. And let's put that way, they choose to believe Speidel's version. So it's Rommel has got something to do with it whatsoever. And I think it's good enough to send Burgdorf there, who's the head of the personnel office, and Meisel, another general. And they have this meeting with Rommel, and they say he thinks they're there to talk about Normandy, but of course they're not. And they say, this is what's happened. We know you're involved. You now get two options. First option is, exactly as you say, you come with us. Here's a cyanide pill. You just bite it, and then you're gone. The good thing for you is your reputation will be protected. You're going to get a state funeral in Berlin. Rommel then said, I don't want a state funeral in Berlin. I want it in Ulm. That's in the southwest, close to where he was from. And the important thing that they also told him, your field marshal's pension and all the other perks that you have as field marshal will be passed on to your then widow. And of course, that's protecting the family. Your family will be fine. Don't do this. We're going to put you in front of the people's court. Like lots of other generals and field marshals to put on. I know what you mean. You say, well, do you really want to put Rommel there? Probably by that stage, the regime was so loony and crazy that they wouldn't even have cared about putting him there. Because lots of other field marshals put their Witzleben in other people. So we're going to do that. You know what the outcome is going to be, and your family is going to end up in a concentration camp. Choose. And so he did. And said goodbye to his wife, stepped in the car. They drove for about 5 minutes. Meisel stepped out, and 5-10 minutes later, Burgdorf was waving at him, and he reports, comes back, and you can see Rommel kind of leaning over, and he was dead, and that was it. And that's the end of Field Marshal Rommel. So we talked about, did he willingly serve the regime? Was he just a soldier? Was he more? We talked about this now. But in the end, this regime, which he probably would have said still to a certain degree, perhaps representing his country, his father, and all these things, all these nuances, these grey areas that we talked about earlier, decides to kill this great war hero of both the First and the Second World Wars. Absolutely crazy. He gets the state funeral. Gerd von Rundstedt goes there, gives the eulogy, who at that stage still believes that he died as because of the wounds that he received from this strafing attack in France. And that was, of course, the official argument as well. So there was some sort of whatever happened to him, whatever the official argument was, some blood clot or whatever it formed, and then that basically killed him. And that is it. And it's interesting, as I said earlier, that particularly in the 1950s, the family, even though everyone knew then by that stage that basically he'd been murdered by the regime, they did not want to stress his relationship or potential relationship, alleged relationship, whatever you want to say now, with the conspirators of the 20th of July, because they knew that the mood in that country was still very much against them. And as we said earlier, that only changes afterwards. And of course, now it's a very, very different story. But it's in many ways, it's a very sad end to Rommel. It's also a very typical end of someone serving the Third Reich, you might say. So again, it shows just the bestiality and nastiness of this particular regime in all its facets and monstrosity.
The beastliness, yes, agreed. I think that's a good way of wrapping up this episode. Unless you've got any final thoughts on Rommel, I hope we've done a reasonable job of trying to approach his politics and his involvement in atrocities or his connection to atrocities, and then his potential involvement in the July 20th plot. All of these are historical minefields for different reasons, because of politics, but also because of historical methodological problems and source problems that we have. So that was our attempt to come to grips with that topic. I hope listeners and viewers out there that you felt that it helped you deal with the topic and get to grips with these controversies and debates as well. So we try to do here on the podcast. If you like what we do in general, of course, we'd be happy if you chose to support us. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. And we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.